Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk about arts-based research and its implications for the empirical study of literature. And thank you for listening to this presentation. Now, let me briefly start my presentation. This is going to make a little bit of noise. I hope that that's not going to be too annoying. And I will stop this little window here, and I will start the presentation. So what I would like to do here is to first introduce some important terms and terminologies, such as arts-related, arts-informed, arts-based research, and will then go on to talk about the implications for the empirical study of literature. So let me get started with arts-related, arts-informed research, or rather, before I go there, let me start out by saying something about the general research traditions. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the quantitative and the qualitative tradition. The quantitative tradition that is typically dominated by a realist ontology, i.e. the idea that there is a reality out there and that we can, however, indirectly collect information about that reality. We do that by using the scientific method. The idea is that our research and our findings are independent of us as the persons conducting the research. Typically, we use a deductive procedure, i.e. we start out from certain assumptions, hypotheses that we then go on to test. And we use numerical data. This can be, for example, a reading speed. It can also be people filling in questionnaires on Likert type scales, for instance. This is, I would say, the kind of research that these days you often find in IGEL. For example, one typical kind of quantitative research would be experiments. So for instance, if you compare different kinds of metaphors and look at reading times, that would be an example of an experiment. Or if you do a survey type study, if, for example, you're interested in the relationship between certain personality characteristics and reading preferences or types of absorption states during reading. Qualitative research is not used in IGEL that much. This is pretty much where I come from. Here, the background tends to be a constructivist, interpretivist one, which is to say the assumption is that there may or may not be a reality out there, but regardless of that, the way we can collect information is only through and by means of our own constructions of that reality, which are in need of interpretation, which is to say that research can never be independent of the person conducting the research, of the participants, of the method used. So research is always very much tied to a specific standpoint. And it's important in qualitative research that the researchers make explicit where they come from and how that may be affecting the findings. The procedure is typically inductive, i.e. working from the data upward. The interest can be in theory building, it can be more descriptive or exploratory. The data tend to be verbal, visual, and in recent times also more frequently multisensory. There's a large amount of research traditions and approaches and methods, such as grounded theory, ethnography, participatory research, interviews, focus groups, observation, and an equal number of methods for data analysis. This has something to do with the assumption that any method can only highlight specific aspects of the data, and that's why many different methods are being used depending on what it is that you want to do research on. Then there's mixed methods. I'm not going to go into that much other than to say that that's a combination of qualitative and quantitative research elements together with an integration of findings obtained in that way. And then there's arts-informed, arts-based research that I would like to talk about in more detail here. Let me start out with arts-related research. Arts-related research, it's basically qualitative research where arts-based data have something of a peripheral function. It can be, for example, as in photo voice, that participants are asked to take photographs and then this is elaborated upon in interviews, or the arts-based data is used to illustrate certain findings. So it's more of a peripheral role that the arts-based data play, and that is not really what my focus is here. My focus here is more on arts-informed research, and here arts-based and other typically qualitative data are of equal importance. And here aesthetic, artistic means are typically used for communicating research findings with the express goal of addressing a broader than just an academic audience. So the idea is to address a broader audience, go beyond the ivory tower, and quite often that's also combined with the goal of empowering those who then read about the research. To illustrate what arts-informed research is all about, let me start out with autoethnography. That's a genre of arts-informed research that's gained a lot in importance over the past 20 years. It is, you could say, the brainchild of Carolyn Ellis. You see her like seminal work here on the slide, the novel called Final, rather not a novel, but an autoethnographic piece of writing called Final Negotiations. And this is where she describes and continues to reflect upon her relationship to Jean Weinstein, her once academic teacher, then partner, someone who was already ill, severely ill at the time when they met with emphysema. And in the book, she describes, reflects upon, and renegotiates the way the relationship changes between mentor and student, between lovers, between caregiver and patient, and how these different relationships, how they influence each other. And that is like the first important piece of autoethnography, and Carolyn Ellis is also the one who coined the term. What's characteristic of autoethnography is that on the one hand, the focus is on the self. To that extent, you could say it is autobiographical. But at the same time, the autoethnographer moves back and forth between the self and the sociocultural broader context, to a certain extent also the context of prior research. So it's never just on the self, it's this characteristic back and forth movement of putting the self into a broader context. In autoethnography, the self is also typically quite vulnerable in a number of ways. On the one hand, the researcher herself, of course, lays herself open and makes herself vulnerable in ways by talking about her personal life that is not exactly typical in academe. To the extent that the autoethnographer writes about the relationship with other persons and these persons are still alive, of course, they are also extremely vulnerable to being recognized, which creates a whole lot of ethical problems that are elaborately discussed in the literature. And finally, the reader also becomes vulnerable, especially in the type of autoethnography represented by Carolyn Ellis called evocative autoethnography, where the goal really is to move the recipient. Topics in evocative autoethnography, they are always topics that go deep. It can be relationships to the mother, it can be relationships to aging parents, death of a partner, coming out, difficult kinds of experiences. And by reading in detail about these experiences, this can be quite emotionally moving for the reader. In fact, that is one of the quality criteria of autoethnography. To what extent is the research able to evoke both emotional and cognitive changes in the recipients? The knowledge created in that way would never be generalizable, general. It would always be standpoint driven. It would always be local knowledge. And the readers would have to decide for themselves what of that research they can take and apply to their own lives. And like arts-informed research in general, it's aimed at a broader audience with the goal of empowerment in the sense of being able to better navigate difficult life situations themselves. Autoethnography is a narrative, a referential format, and while in principle arts-informed research can make use of any medium, and for example dance, music, film have been used in arts-informed research, the use of narrative referential formats is more typical. Another example of that would be fiction-based research. And fiction-based research, the idea is you conduct your research as you normally would, and then you describe the findings, you present the findings in the form of a novel. An important representative of that genre of research is Patricia Levy, and she's written a number of novels based on her interview type research. The most recent one, Bloom, for instance, has actually been nominated for a number of prizes. And Sense Publishers, and all the titles you see here are by Sense. They've even established a series exclusively for fiction-based research. I've read a number of these, and they're very, very interesting. And they can be very moving as well. A bit less referential, leaving more room for interpretation, is making use of poetry in bringing across and presenting findings. There's a number of strategies of how exactly to do this. Here you see one example, poetic transcription developed by Glenn. And the way she does it is she first conducts a thematic analysis of the data, and then based on the themes, she identifies especially rich passages, words, partial sentences, extracts those from the interview transcripts, and combines them, strings them together into poems. And this poem that you see here, If It Rains Too Much, that is taken from a series of interviews with Donna Juana. She's a elderly researcher, educator, friend of Glenn's. And I think you get an idea of poetic description if I just read this out to you. If it rains too much, I have to admit I spent money without giving it too much importance. Maybe I see a book, and I'm not going to read that book just now. I buy it. I buy the book. I go to the store, I see something beautiful, a vase or something like that, and I buy it without thinking whether I have the money. That's the reason I have not money for ceiling repairs. Just now, it's all right, because it's not raining. But if it rains too much, oh well, it comes down. So these are all phrases taken verbatim from the interview transcripts, and you can see how, being strung together, they really do have a poetic rhythm to them, and they do bring across something of the personality of the person being interviewed here, and her entire manner of speech, in a way that the regular presentation of interview findings can't do. I should also mention ethnotheater, ethnodrama here. That's another very prominent genre of communicating findings to a broader audience. Denzin, an important qualitative researcher, he speaks of the pedagogical potential of the performative, for example. What you see here, the scene is taken from a project called Cracked. Crack is an innovative research-based play and film that follows persons with dementia and their families on their unique journeys from diagnosis to their new lives in long-term care. And what's interesting here is that this transcends what I've described so far. So this example of Cracked goes beyond just using a format such as theater to communicate findings. This is already more in the direction of arts-based research, because what the researchers did was they actually developed the play together with the participants. So the entire process of developing the play, performing the play, is part of the research process, and of course then performing the play, and in that way communicating important aspects to an audience is just one particular aspect of that. And with this participatory aspect and including the participants in the research, this transcends arts-informed research in the narrow sense and takes us to arts-based research. Arts-based research, in the words of Barron and Elsner, is an effort to extend beyond the limiting constraints of discursive communication in order to express meanings that would otherwise be ineffable. It represents an effort to explore the potentialities of an approach to representation that is rooted in aesthetic considerations and that, when it is at its best, culminates in the creation of something close to a work of art. Like, for example, the play Cracked. Something similar to arts-based research has in the meantime also been developed in colleges of art. That's called artistic research. Originally, that was used to study primarily the creative process, but by now it's used to study a number of other topics as well. And just to give you a brief sense of the difference between arts-informed, arts-based research and artistic research, in arts-informed research, arts and aesthetics are still subjugated to the research purpose. So arts are used in the service of research. With arts-based research, research is conducted by engaging in an art form, i.e. here, a different kind of knowledge is sought after, preconceptual, non-discursive knowledge is sought after, and it originates in the social sciences, whereas artistic research, the way of doing it, the goals are similar to arts-based research, but it originates in colleges of art, and because of that, overall, the work of art and its artistic merit have a higher value than they do in arts-based research. In arts-based research, a wide variety of different art forms has been used, typically more non-referential ones than in arts-informed research. So the whole gamut of painting, film, dance, music, etc. The image you see here, that's also the title slide, is taken from a project by Jack McDulloch. He did his thesis on the embodied performance of gender, and he created music that he could show would be suitable to either evoke more masculine or more feminine kinds of movements. And he then played this and deliberately moved against the grain of the music. So with the feminine movement evoking music, he moved in masculine ways and vice versa. And he also included participants doing that and paying very, very close attention to when he was starting to feel uncomfortable, for instance. So here the body is really a very, very finely tuned instrument of research in this particular project. But that's just one example out of many. Of course, a tradition like arts-based research, it raises a lot of questions. It raises the question of what exactly is knowledge. It raises the question of what exactly is research. If you look at the quote like Picasso's, "I never made a painting as a work of art, it's all research," you wonder, well, does it take more than just a work of art to do research? Is the art, is that already the research? What more does it need? I'm not going to go into those here. That's for possibly another time. Let me now move on to arts-based research in the broader landscape, especially in relationship to the empirical study of literature. Let me start out by just very briefly comparing qualitative research and arts-based research in terms of where they differ, because I think this also helps to highlight some of the characteristics of arts-based research. So in qualitative research, typically the goal is still to create discursive knowledge. As I just mentioned, in arts-based research, it's preconceptual, non-discursive knowledge. Qualitative research typically, while working inductively, still seeks to answer a research question. Whereas with arts-based research, often the goal is just to generate new perspectives, new problem descriptions. Qualitative research is completed once the research question has been answered. In arts-based research, that's different. The research extends into reception. So for example, projects like CRAT that I mentioned earlier, what they typically do is once they perform the play, they also do something called post-performance sessions, i.e. they include the recipients, conduct, for example, interviews with them, want to find out about their reaction to the play, which generates additional data, which can then become part of the play itself. So the research always extends into reception. It's always ultimately incomplete. And qualitative research would typically focus on an academic audience, whereas arts-based research would be focused on a broader public with this goal of empowerment. Now, why would arts-based research be especially interesting for the empirical study of literature? I see two main reasons. The first one is what I call mind the gap. Of course, please don't get me wrong. for example, experimental research, other types of quantitative research, interview type research. It's all important, and we need that kind of research to find out more about reading processes. We need to find out more about factors that influence our reading experience. But nevertheless, when you look at the actual experience of reading, it's very different. And it's very well known that quantitative studies, they are great for example, establishing causality, but it can be difficult in terms of ecological validity, transferring the findings to everyday kinds of settings. That's what I call the gap between the studies and our actual reading experience. Now, this gap could, of course, in principle, be filled by qualitative research, and it has to some extent been filled by qualitative research. But I find the arts-based research interesting because of a number of parallels in basic assumptions between our topic of reading and the arts-based research itself. First of all, there's this wanting to create preconceptual, non-discursive knowledge in arts-based research. So much of what happens as we read also remains at the preconceptual level. So there's a first parallel. A second parallel, when we look at how we conceptualize the process of reading, well, there's the text, but of course the text doesn't determine the reception or the effects. So the reading process invariably includes the recipient and of course extends beyond the reading process itself, just as in arts-based research, it extends into the post-research, post-reception phase. And I find the idea of reaching out to a broader audience very appealing. Why not do that? Reading is something that is so close to many people's hearts. Why not reach more people with the kind of research that we do? Let me very briefly, I know I'm already over time, conclude with the potential that I see for arts-informed and arts-based research in the empirical study of literature. I could imagine, for example, autoethnographies of authors, of actors in the distribution process, especially with the current pandemic and everything changed about the literary system. I could imagine autoethnographies of one's journey as a reader. And I could imagine making use of many different art forms in studying and exploring specific reading experiences, be it one reader reading and experiencing one book, be it several readers and how they experience the same book, be it several readers experiencing the same book in different formats, such as print, audio, digital, etc. These are just some ideas. I hope I could give you a sense of what arts-based research is all about and how it could potentially inspire the empirical study of literature. And I look forward to hearing your questions if there is an opportunity for that in this format. Thank you very much.